welcome to folks joining via the recording. So today for the agenda, let me just share my screen. We will be talking about the sale of intellectual property, which is something which is pretty tricky from a SciDep CRM perspective, but given our discussion on the last call under issue 277, actually seems to fall out quite neatly with only one pretty minor extension to CRM, but we shall walk through that nonetheless. And then on to API related topics. On the last two or three calls, we've talked about how to partition up the graph into different response documents. And I think we have enough consensus around that we can start to write up what that is, and then do some experimental implementations or update existing implementations. So now on this call we'll talk about formats, e.g. what formats should those responses come in, and if there are multiple formats, how do you get access to them, which is called content negotiation, and then should there be patterns for URIs or not, or what patterns should we recommend or what patterns should we require for how to construct the URIs for these responses. So on to the first one. So the first issue is issue 277. Sorry, the first issue is really issue 280, which is the sale of non-physical things, such as the rights to perform something, or copyright is not necessarily a physical thing, etc. But you can still pay for the ownership of non-physical things, which is not something that the CRM allows for, because acquisition transfers the title of a physical thing rather than any thing that you can talk about. So the example or the use case would be the acquisition of the right to perform some performance art, such as a museum in Norway has the right to perform a piece of modern art that has lots of video and audio and moving things around on a stage and so forth. And if they paid money for that, or at some point they acquired the rights to do that, whether they paid money for it or not. I actually think it was part of an archive of the artist. So there is the acquisition of a right, but not the acquisition of a physical thing. If you acquired the physical videotape to play, that doesn't also give you the right to perform that videotape, to display it in public. So this had two side effects. We have to talk about sets as conceptual things, groupings of arbitrary objects, arbitrary entities, rather than physical aggregates, such as a chess set where everything in it is physical, because we can have these sets of things, such as an auction for the videotape and the right to perform to display the contents of the tape. So that means we need sets, and it also means that we need to talk about rights rather than just the transfer of ownership of physical objects. Any questions about the sort of requirements and use case?
I don't have a question, but
Sure.
maybe we should, the range of the transfer of title to physical thing is odd. And if we, if we have some examples from the membership of Linked Art that we can throw, then maybe we should make an effort to stir up CRM SIG list with a conversation about moving that range up, which would parcel, move towards harmonization slowly but surely.
Yep.
Maybe.
Yep.
But I think it would be best to do it by having that one or two examples to not imagine, have the conversation about whether or not such use cases exist in the museums.
Yep, agreed. So then the solution for 277 that we discussed last time, so this issue is the partial ownership one, where we want to say that two or more actors possess some part of the ownership of a thing, and the decision there was to have an activity that looks like acquisition, but instead of transferring the title of a thing, instead, I forget exactly the relationship name that we used, but establishes a right for a person, and can invalidate other rights at the same time. So that means that then once you have partial rights, e.g. you can split the right up, then you can talk about the transfer of rights between people, which means that we can use that same pattern for transferring rights over non-physical things in the same way as we can talk about the partial rights over physical things. So I'm going to swap my share over to the model that we talked about for it. So you should now see a bunch of bubbles. And what we're interested in is this guy. So in general, we have provenance activities that can consist of acquisitions and transfers of custody and rights acquisitions and other activities. Rights acquisitions establish rights for actors, and they can invalidate other previously existing rights. So given this pattern, we can reapply it to say that there is a rights acquisition which establishes the right to perform something. So the right would be over some non-physical thing. It can be classified as the right to perform or the right to whatever, and so on. So in the model, right is over legal objects, which are both physical things and symbolic objects. So you can't have rights over purely conceptual things. There has to be some sort of symbolic nature, but that includes information objects, which includes visual items, it includes texts. One imagines it would include audio things if audio things were a class in CRM, and so on. So I'll swap my share yet again over to CRM. So here's legal object. which is the superclass of physical things and symbolic objects. And here's the link over to right. P104 is subject to, applies to. So the right applies to any physical or symbolic thing. So it's not, you can't have a right over an idea, but you can have it over the expression of the idea in symbols, which I think is reflects what the law is, regardless. So back to the issue, I think that by reusing the rights acquisition class with the rights that would then be subject to the if not conceptual, then at least symbolic thing, we have accomplished what we set out to do.
So the new class is, would it be a sibling class of regular acquisition, or a child, or undecided?
I think it would be a sibling, but yeah, open to discussion. What would it mean for a rights acquisition to both establish a right and transfer the title of in the same?
Well, it'd be convenient, but
yes. Then we would probably want to use the new class for all of our acquisitions, so that we could have rights acquisitions be used for both transferring title in the common case and transferring the actual right of ownership in the more complex case. But then we would be drifting quite far away from sort of the very common class usage in CRM.
Yeah, and it's not clear that it's really an ISA relationship. It's probably an ISA relationship to a higher class that doesn't exist, and which, if it was made, could subsume or take over some of the properties of those lower classes. And so yeah, I would imagine that probably for now it has to be sibling. And then if we also throw in the question of why can't you transfer the title of a physical thing, then we could create the easiest transition if there's going to be any motion at the CRM level or the SIG level.
Yep. Yeah, it seems like there's acquisition, move, transfer of custody, the new payment, our payment class for transferring money, and this one, that all sort of move things around in physical or legal space. That, to me at least, seem cognate somehow. But yeah, could potentially benefit from a superclass. Any further questions or thoughts or comments or discussion? It's a shame that Lynn isn't here, of course, but everyone does have provenance needs. Right. So no concerns about this one, and we should write it up and keep going.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Okay, so these guys. The next topic is around the API. So previously we've talked about partitioning. but that's all very well, but we still need to be able to serialize the partitioned graph and return it to the client. So the first issue is formats. So which linked data formats should we be using? I think the obvious first answer is we must at least use JSON-LD. That in every example we have the JSON. It's the sort of lingua franca of web development at the moment, in the way that XML was 10 years ago. It's been demonstrated many times now that JSON-LD is the easiest format to consume and a very easy format to construct. So unless there's any objections, I think the default required format should be JSON-LD. And yep, no objections, I hope. So then the question is, are there other formats that we should either require or recommend or even just make optional for how to return the data? So some of the other options would be Turtle or RDF-XML. So for example, in the site, it's easy to transform between RDF syntaxes. So for people who like to look at the older, more graphy oriented form, there's a Turtle representation with all of the lovely 22 bloody blahs and similar. And that's a nice straightforward one, but there's a more interesting one.
I think that there's a big case for that because it's facilitated by, because we're not stopped from doing that, and it makes sure that linked art doesn't become a mega silo of its own,
Yep.
and that other people who are not using linked art but you are using CRM can use linked art data, eventually contribute to it, link to it. So I don't know, I think that's an important feature to make available.
And then are there, in the CRM space, are there particular formats that are used?
I mean, I think a lot of people use RDF-XML and Turtle. But I could inquire around, I mean, and then.
I think those are from my experience as well, in the general linked data community, JSON-LD, RDF-XML, and Turtle are the three formats that people use.
Are there tools that facilitate conversion between those, or between, say, the JSON-LD format, with a configuration to the Turtle?
Yep. So most of the RDF libraries, if they support JSON-LD, then they support the transformation between syntaxes. So what I do here is I use Cromulent to build this, which is not RDF aware. It's just an object model based on the ontology. Then to generate these, of course, I don't do any of it by hand. That would be nightmarishly tedious. So I use RDFlib to parse the JSON-LD and then reserialize it as Turtle. And it's maybe 5 lines of code. It's a little bit more complicated at the moment because RDFlib doesn't support JSON LD 1.1 yet, and we use some 1.1 features. So it's maybe more like 8 lines of code in that I need to use both PyLD, which does support 1.1, and RDFlib to generate Turtle in particular. But even still, even with that extra layer of complexity, it's only 8 to 10 lines of code, which I'm happy to share, of course. So, Adam, you're probably the best person to talk about transformations of RDF. In the Jenna space, it's the same, if I recall correctly.
I'm sorry, the same in what exact sense?
So that the libraries that support JSON LD are all built on top of an RDF stack, and the RDF stack supports serialization into different formats. So
no, that's not really how JSON LD came to Jenna. Anyway, what happened in that situation? I can't speak much beyond that in terms of architecture, but the RDF stack is pre-existent, was pre-existent. Jenna then adopted a JSON LD library that offered a good option there, JSON LD Java, as you know, Rob, and it really exists as a format as far as Jenna's concerned. The RDF model, meta model that Jenna employs, is entirely Jenna's property, as it were. So from Jenna's point of view, it's just all RDF, and JSON LD is one way to write it down.
Yep.
And this is why. And Jenna actually uses internally a generalized model in which predicates can be, are not constrained to IRIs, and I think that's the only place where this actually becomes an interesting question technically. As you're aware, there have been those who propose that the JSON LD model should be a little more general than RDF and provide for that kind of recording that kind of assertion, whatever it is. In the way that it's been wired together in Jenna, though, we don't, go for that. It's whatever comes out of JSON LD Java gets turned into RDF qua RDF, not some generalized RDF. So that's the only place that really we found that really arises the question of kind of who owns the model or what's going to what. That having been said, putting on a different hat that I sometimes wear, as Rob knows, which is as a member of the JSON LD working group at W3C, which Rob is the chair. My stance on this is that we don't have much business specifying that much about interchange other than at the API endpoints. We want to say some very strong things there, and frankly, I think we said as much or more than we already need to, which is that everything should be available in JSON LD according to a shared context and if necessary, framing. And that's about all I think we should say about this question. If people want to use other formats for other purposes, that makes a lot of sense. We all know JSON LD is pretty verbose in a technical sense. It's often convenient technically to work on more compact representations or to go to interchange formats. I don't know that we need to specify any of that at this stage, other than you should be able to produce JSON LD at the API. And other than that, let's talk entirely about the model and leave questions of where the angle brackets go to particular work that is actually happening.
So, Adam, just to confirm that in Jenna, if there was JSON LD, then it can read it in and then re-serialize it as RDF XML or Turtle.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think any framework can do that. Yeah, there's a bazillion tools that'll do that. I think the other direction, as you know, Rob, will require that we share the context, but that's kind of, I think, a given from the word go, right? And I don't see that as being any kind of barrier. I also, to be very honest, would be extremely surprised if that many institutions were generating RDF internally as the management format and then producing JSON LD from it. That's just my thought, but let's see. That's what I don't want to constrain or really say that much about. You at the Getty are a great example, I think, of an institution that's a little weird in that you're a little more advanced than most, and I wouldn't want to put any burdens on that, or stop you from using technologies internally that may be different than or more advanced than another institution.
Well, I'm not sure about that.
Or at least in a particular
Thank you for
direction.
the praise, but
Yeah.
yeah, some of our technology stacks are equally archaic.
Funky.
Yeah, everything. Then to go back to the formats. Well, actually, no. Sorry, Dave. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So, at least in JavaScript, Python, and Java, there are tools. In Ruby, there are tools that will automatically transform between the syntaxes. Particularly with JSON-LD as the input as opposed to the one of the other ones. So everything must be available in JSON-LD. I think we agree on that one. And then we could, I think the other statement is either resources should or resources may also be available in other RDF or in other formats, just to be more general. So
Ask just a hypothetical without, I don't want to go too far down this thought, but as far as the partitioning discussions that we've had so far, if there was a large RDF source, for example, then how are those tools used to enforce the partitioning that we've already discussed?
That is a very good question, one that many PhDs have probably been written about. At the moment, the way that we do it here, at least, is if we need to pull out data from a big triple store, where it's just one single big pool of data, we have two different patterns. One is to use named graphs to say this named graph represents the partition. So we have a named graph that is the boundary for the description of irises. And we have another named graph which is the boundary for Van Gogh. And then because production is part of the object representation, the object then, or the production within the object, refers to Van Gogh as the actor that carried out the production of the object. So that's nice and easy, but makes querying painful. And so then we have another, so that's sort of we use the name graphs for maintaining the record shape. And then we have another massive graph, named graph, of just all the data smushed together for graph queries. So if we want to do sort of record-oriented queries, we use the small partitions and if the small name graphs, and if we want to do just regular queries, we use the big pool. This works quite well on Neptune, which is our triple store that we're moving to. But it's certainly not cheap in that we're maintaining the same triples many times, at least 3 times, and then that per instance of Neptune. So then you add on the AWS costs, and it becomes quite an expensive proposition. The other way is to use Sparkle construct queries to say, from this triple store, here are all of the bits of the graph that I want to pull out. And that is less expensive money-wise and more expensive intellectual-wise, in that every representation needs to have a construct query that's, would be dozens of lines long, if not hundreds of lines long. So then it becomes computationally expensive and also tricky to maintain those queries. And that is why we do not do this for our systems of record. Instead, we have record-oriented systems that we then put into triple stores in order to do data integration rather than to do data management. But yeah, it's possible. But it takes infrastructure for sure.
Thank you. That was fascinating for somebody who's not a Sparkle or RDF expert.
Yep. So, all right, I'm going to copy these two statements down to the bottom. So I think we agree everything must be in JSON-LD. They may be available in other formats because we don't specify what you can't do. Is there something in the middle here? Resources should. Resources should be available in Turtle and RDF-XML, or just remain silent. I think George was in favor of RDF-XML and Turtle, and I think Adam, you were in favor of remaining silent and just letting it fall through to May.
What about, like, I don't know, maybe May already covers that, but like, the question is, if you want to achieve a broader level of interchangeability with people who natively use RDF XML, so on and so forth, then it would be, given that it's technologically relatively feasible to make these transformations pre-JSON LD, etc., that you would want to make them available in these formats to reach that part of the community.
Yeah.
If that's not a use case for you, then there's nothing enforcing it upon you, or if you don't think it's a use case for you.
Yep. Adam, how do you feel about that with the caveat of,
I mean, I'm not going to lie down on the road on this one, as someone we both know often says, but I worry about the fact that, like, most people reading that statement are not going to have any idea whether that's a use case for them, and if it is, it's not going to be until they've had some success, creating and using linked art. And I don't like necessarily the idea of encouraging them to think ahead in that particular way. That having been said, I mean, a should is a should. It's as long as we're very clear that this is not a case of, like, how do I put this?
Yeah.
I think it's a difference. I think it's a distinction we want to make between you're trying to offer data to aggregate into the Linked.art community, and I think we should make very clear that we ask for JSON LD and that's it. To do that. Now, if you want to offer, this is a feed into a larger aggregation, then perhaps other RDF formats become useful or whatever it is. But I just don't want people to see that should and feel too much pressure on it. But I think a lot of that's the language and the wording that we use here, and I'm sure we can be very clear about it. And I'd also like to offer the possibility that we deploy here a practice that other groups have deployed in similar situations, which is to divide between a more formal specification and other documents. That's obviously a major step to undertake, and I'm not suggesting that we suddenly do that on a whim on a call. But this is maybe a sign, this kind of question arising where we're getting into the fine points of must and should, that maybe we want to separate out some of those shoulds and have more room to discuss them at length. For example, we could offer a note on interchange and explain, if you limit yourself to JSON LD, then you may have limited yourself in these terms. But it's difficult to know where to say that, and I guess what I'm quibbling with is the having this explanation about interchange in the larger community in the middle of a document that's must and should, and how do you want your JSON endpoints to appear. So, but I'm not against it in the end, and I think this is a fine resolution as long as we sort of get the wording right.
I agree with whoever wrote best practice in the document there. It sounds to me like a best practice, and I think it can be helpful to discuss as a community what the common or preferred approaches are towards integration, so that we're not all approaching aggregators with a different story or a different approach. But I agree with Adam. It's not really part of the spec per se.
Yeah, and I think you touched on the most crucial point, which is talking about different kinds of aggregation and different kinds of interchange, and that's why it requires some context and some explanation. But I think we can all, it sounds like we are all in pretty tight agreement that the must is JSON LD, and that's the only must.
Edward, you had a comment in chat. If you want to say it out loud. And remember to unmute. Well, then I will repeat Edward's comment, which is, what's lost if we don't?
Yeah, I don't mean to be a devil advocate about it, but the case for providing other formats is that it might be more convenient for other experts in linked data domains, and that there are already technologies that more easily, but that easily perform serialization. What are we actually giving to people?
Yeah. I think.
Well, so part of that is, I think, Edward, that we're discussing a document that, or not, it's not a document in a formal sense, but we're discussing a specification that we think is for an API, but we now have all these other interchange use cases in mind. These do not occur typically via some kind of RESTful API like we're talking about. Maybe people harvest from an API with spiders or things like that, but more usual has been the provision of bulk download or some other means of that sort. And I think that's part of what's tripping us up. We're like, we want to say that you must provide JSON LD because that's for the API. But what about all these other possibilities? Well, are we still talking about the API? Or have we moved on to talk about like providing data dumps and what are good practices there? Which was a very important thing to talk about, but it's different,
Yeah, I think, I agree with that. That if we say for the Linked Art API, the format is JSON LD, and if you want to go beyond the Linked Art community to communities that use formats other than JSON LD, then you are encouraged to do so, but that we don't make any requirements or similar about how you do that, or if you do that, or so on. But as a best practice, if this is something that you care about, because many of us also care about it, then the reason you should use RDF XML and or Turtle, and you should probably do content negotiation, and you should follow the linked data on the web best practices for doing these sorts of things.
So if that stuff is established best practice, then maybe we shouldn't be specifying for that, which starts to leave our domain, and we should just, allow people to implement whatever other like joined up things that they want, however they want to adhere or not to web standards.
Yeah. And I think it's sort of it's like the sort of best practice note or an implementation note or it's not part of the spec. It's just, if you don't, it would be nice to give advice to people who are just coming to this world through Linked Art and finding, oh wow, there's actually all of these other resources that are available in these weird XML formats and this weird Turtle thing. I thought Turtle was drawing little lines on a screen. So if we can encourage people to do things in a way from the beginning that will put them in a good position to move forwards more easily, if they want to, then it would be nice to have that information available, but not, to Adam's point, we shouldn't make people feel bad about not doing it, which sometimes does, right? It's like, well, I should do this, but I'm not. Well, that makes me a bad person. Like, no, it just means that you're caring about Linked Art and the primary use case, and this is a separate use case, a separate set of requirements.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rob. And I think one thing to draw on there, take forward is, and I don't know how formal we'd ever want to be about this. We've talked about ideas like profiles, and they have their problems, but just a notion of ordering there, like first do this. First do JSON LD at an API that you can maintain, that you're happy with, that works with your systems, and then move on to be an even better part of the community by doing other things. But as long as we have that sense of priority, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah.
Is there a case where in the partitioning and the API that we're talking about, would having a response that was in RDF, say for the scope of a person, an artist, is there a use case for having that data in RDF? I mean, is there anything practical that can be done with just that portion of the graph as it relates to other systems or other tools? I mean, I'm just trying to think through whether that would even be something to have a future discussion about as far as the format returned by the API that we're talking about as part of Linked Art.
Hello, everybody. I can probably step in at this point. First of all, Thomas in Zurich, sorry for being late. We are currently experimenting with RDF in LDP containers, and this is exactly the use case you just addressed. So what we are doing is we try to give access to reference data such as persons, places, groups, and so on. That actually can be used to enrich the own data. So essentially, somebody could fetch the RDF data and add own data to these, whatever it is, a person, a concept, whatever. And we decided to go for LDP containers because we are using actually the MetaFacts platform, which handles them quite good, and there is kind of a mix between data management and data integration. So that's Rob's point, that this does not necessarily need to be the same and the same tool set and tech stack, but we try to kind of to go as far as possible as we come with LDP containers. And the expectations we have is that the people would access these data, would enrich them, would deliver back data, and so on. But this is really a smart, let's say a small line between, or quite a narrow line between data management and data integration. But we are not at a point where we can really give results and saying this actually works. But I do for myself, or for ourselves, we do see a certain value in having these data as RDF data. Then again, the question is, does this need to be part of the linked art specification? To which I don't have any answer, to be honest. And second remark, sorry for being late.
Yep, no worries. Yeah. Adam, you were part of LDP, if I recall.
No, I wasn't. I don't think I was on the. No, I wasn't on the working group. But certainly, I'm a huge fan, and I'm in no way. The ideas that Thomas is putting out there sound great to me. I mean, I think that might be a topic for some thinking, and possibly a sort of subcommittee, as it were, or subgroup to go away and think about. Would we want to go as far as specifying LDP as a substrate for the API, and then simply relying on those concepts, in the way that Thomas is describing there? I think that's a very interesting potential road. I would be very hesitant to commit everyone to it, without a lot of thought and making sure that it's sort of it's very. And I know you guys, Rob, and a lot of other folks put a lot of thought into making sure that LDP is easy to implement, and it is. But let's just make sure that all of it fits together. Yep. But I think that, I don't know, that might be a direction that answers some of these questions for us, not in the sense of what are the partitions, we still need to think about that, but how do they develop naturally in the interaction in the API? LDP would answer that fairly straightforwardly. Yeah.
Well, looking at the Looking at the time, we only have a couple of minutes left, so we are certainly not going to talk about URI patterns. That's a big topic, which we can push till 2 weeks' time. Then January 15th, we should talk about sort of levels of implementation. Should are there things that we can say you really must do this to be at all compliant, and if you do all of these, then you get the gold stamp. And then here is level 2, where you've got all of these optional features implemented and so on. And then meaning it would be February for talking about LDP. Would be the next slot after that. So given where we have arrived at, I think we don't need to talk about content negotiation, because this would just be, you should, if you care about other interchange tactics or patterns, then you should do whatever it takes to enable those, which is likely going to be content negotiation. And yeah, the spec says May. The spec says the first says these two. Everything must be in JSON-LD, and it may be available in other formats. And then in a best practice note or some other document, we say, well, here is some general advice as to for implementation, and that would then talk about content negotiation as well. I think that's where we are at. Yes. No one is saying no, which is good. Right. Well, that was pretty good timing. So we are at the top of the hour. Thank you everyone for joining. We have another call in 2 weeks. We will talk about URI patterns, probably for a good amount of time. Some hopefully more logistics about the face-to-face coming up in January, and then something that has come up that we have, well, I know comes up a lot, but we have here at the Getty arrived at an idea for how to make it not as obnoxious as it often is, which is how to do possiblies and probablys and so on in a way that sort of fits in with the rest of the linked art patterns. So unless there are other provenance related topics, we could move on to that. Or if there are other topics, then yeah, please do email me with them, or Manuel as co-chair, and we can slot them in. Great. Well, thank you everyone. We will have another call in a couple of weeks.